And thanks to the Nyack Library for hosting this event, and for the Historical Society of the Nyaks for producing every year the John Scott Armchair Walking Tours. As Rosemary mentioned, I'm the Vice President of the Mount Moor Cemetery Association, and several of our board members are on this call this evening, and we'll hear from them, but I just want to recognize Willie Trotman, who is the president of the Spring Valley NAACP, trustee, a board member of Mount Moor, and a veteran of the United States Army. He was drafted in 1966 and served to 1968, including 1 year in Vietnam. And Ed England, who is the president of the Mount Moor Cemetery Association, a member of the United States Navy Reserve from 1983 to 2004, and a retired NYPD sergeant. So I hope that many of you came because you've known about Mount Moor, but I'm sure that there are many who haven't. It's located adjacent to the Palisades Mall, which is a part of its history and story. It's off of Route 59. It's a kind of a pocket park. We're going to learn more about the men who are buried there. There are about 90 to 100 souls in that cemetery, and about 30 of them are veterans. But we are going to focus this evening on the veterans, and particularly the veterans who served in the Civil War. This hallowed ground was named Mount because of its steep slope, and Moor because of that name for African that was popularized by Shakespeare and Othello. But it represents Mount Moor, the shortest trip in our region that you can take to go extremely far back in history, a history that started in 1849 when cemeteries in America were segregated. So our guide, who's going to help us time travel back to the Civil War tonight, is Bill Stump. Bill Stump is a resident of Cortland in Westchester County. He has a lifelong love of history. He received his degree in history from the University of Maryland in 2006. He is a sergeant in the New York Army National Guard, assigned as a military police officer in the 442nd Military Police Company. He has been called to active service on multiple occasions, including a year-long deployment in Ramadi, Iraq in 2010 as a member of the police transition team working with the Iraqi police. He served in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba in 2016, and was part of the humanitarian mission to Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in 2017. He is currently assigned to the Joint Task Force COVID in response to COVID-19 pandemic. He is a detective in the New York the NYPD, assigned to the 42nd Detective Squad in the Morrisania section of the Bronx. Tonight, he is representing the Augustus Van Horn Ellis Camp 124 of the Sons of the Union Veterans of the Civil War as a junior vice commander. The SUVCW is a fraternal organization open to any man who is passionate about the men who fought for freedom in the Civil War. Bill's great-great-grandfather, Henry Parr, served in Georgia with Company K 187 of the Ohio Volunteers. But before Bill calls out the names of some of the colored troops that fought in the Civil War and are buried in Mount Moor, I wish to invoke the name of the man who made it possible for us to explore this history and to learn from our ancestors. That name is Hezekiah Easter. The original plans of the Pyramid Company included burying the cemetery under earth and concrete to expand parking opportunities for a mall that they were about to construct. This episode is captured in the film Mega Mall by Vera Arnau. Hezekiah Easter was the first African-American in the Rockland County Legislature, and he stood his ground against what was then the second largest development project or mall development in America, assuring that those who were buried here and who were buried during Jim Crow funerals and others who fought in every conflict since the Spanish-American War were given an opportunity to rest in peace and power. On March 13th, 2007, Hezekiah Easter was the last person buried in Mount Moor. So we hope that you will find this presentation this evening interesting, and but more so, we hope that when you learn what we know about these men and what we're learning about these men and the men and women who are buried there, that every time you pass Mount Moor Cemetery, you will nod. And the more you'll learn, I think some of you will want to salute. And we hope you visit. You can see Hezekiah Easter's grave and say hello. And it's an incredible journey that you can take. It's very short, and we're so happy to have someone of the caliber of William Stump to lead us on this armchair tour of Mount Moor Cemetery. So thank you for hosting us, Rosemary, and I'd like to turn it over to Bill Stump.
Bill, thank you so much for that introduction. I want to start off by thanking the Nyack Library for hosting us, and I want to thank the Mount Moor Cemetery Association with Ed England and Bill Batson and Willie Trotman for allowing me to get involved in this great project. So I come to you today as a member of the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. Kind of a long title, but we've been around since 1881. This is the symbol of our organization that you're looking at. Our motto is preserved by the grace of God, which is basically what the Union Army fought for, the preservation of the Union, one country inseparable. And in the Sons of Union Veterans, we're charged with keeping, we use General John Logan's phraseology. He was the guy who invented Memorial Day, in that we are to keep green the memory of those who fought in the war. And one of the ways in which we keep green the memory is through their headstones. Headstones can tell you a lot. Military headstones in particular can tell you a lot about the men who rest beneath them. Now, the Veterans Administration of America furnishes a headstone to any veteran buried anywhere in the world. And they're guaranteed to have a marked headstone until the end of America. That's usually the way that I put it. So as we can see, you'll see tonight when we look at the graves in Mount Moor, the ensuing 160 years since the war has not been too kind to these headstones. Both vandalism and weathering have degraded some of them. And essentially what I'm doing with the Mount Moor Cemetery Association is I'm submitting these applications to the VA, and then they produce a new headstone to be emplaced where the old one would be removed. And in the course of, you have to do a little bit of a deep dive and figure out where these guys served and when they served. And in the course of that, we really unearthed a lot of amazing stories. So the Sons of Union Veterans, we are actually the congressionally chartered descendant organization of the Grand Army of the Republic. And I'll just click to the next slide if I can get this to work. Here we are. So the Grand Army of the Republic, fraternity, loyalty, and charity. That's America's first major veterans organization. It's what those returning men from the Union Army joined to keep the camaraderie and companionship that they had experienced on the battlefield. Basically, everything you know about organizations like the VFW and the American Legion, they take after the GAR. And that goes down to naming their posts. GAR posts were either named after paramount generals or local men who had lost their lives in the war. Now in Nyack, there were 3 GAR posts. There was Post 26, which later becomes Post 82. That was named for Tout J. Waldron of the 17th New York. He died of wounds he received at the first Battle of Bull Run, the first major battle of the war, and he's buried in Oak Hill. We're going to be talking later about Post 172, which was named for Colonel William C. Silliman, who was the commander of the 26th USCT, and was actually a former member of the 124th New York, which is the unit that my organization is named after. And he died of wounds he received at the Battle of Tillafini in South Carolina in December of 1864. You also had Post 253, John Hancock. You also had posts in Suffren, Spring Valley, and Haverstraw. The Haverstraw and Spring Valley posts were both named for Edward Pye. He was a colonel in the 95th New York, and he was killed in the brutal last charge, and frankly unnecessary last charge, at Cold Harbor, and he rests in Oak Hill. But when it comes to the discussion of the men who rest at Mount Moor, who fought in the Civil War, we have to start with a little bit of background about what it meant to be an African American serving in the Army in 1863, and how America reconciled itself with black service. So it all starts with General Benjamin Butler, called Beast Butler by the Confederates. He was what was known as a political general. A political general was someone who was not named for their military ability in the Union Army, but basically for who they were and who they know. He was a member of, I believe, the Massachusetts House of Representatives. He goes on to be the governor of Massachusetts for multiple terms. And he was a lawyer by trade. And he was in command of Fortress Monroe in Virginia. And while there, slaves had been escaping from the surrounding countryside and basically seeking shelter with the Union Army. And a Confederate envoy traveled to Fortress Monroe and said to General Butler that under the Fugitive Slave Act, any slaves who had absconded and come to Fortress Monroe legally had to be turned back over to their owners. Now, Butler, as I said, was a lawyer, and he said, "I'm afraid not. The Confederacy views itself as an independent nation. Therefore, federal law should not apply in the Confederacy. Not to mention, by denying these Confederate plantations and other places their slave labor, they are actually denying the Confederacy war production." So he labeled the escaped slaves contrabands and said he would not turn them over, much to the consternation of the Confederates, as they were contrabands of war. It then becomes U.S. policy that the contrabands would be given a stipend and put to work, building fortifications and the like. The quote from Frederick Douglass is, "Benjamin Butler, that old Roman, made the black man a contraband. Abraham Lincoln made him freedman, and Ulysses S. Grant made him a citizen." So once we get to the point where we have contrabands working with the Union Army, the obvious question, and especially among free African Americans in the northern states, is to get them into the fight, to arm them. And I will give you two positions on the arming of African Americans. The first one will come from the Confederacy. This is Thomas Howell Cobb. He's the former Speaker of the House before he defected and turned traitor. Former governor of Georgia, and he's the president of the Confederate Provisional Congress. And at the end of the war, even the Confederacy was debating arming both slaves and free black men. And he responded to this by saying, "You cannot make soldiers of slaves or slaves of soldiers. The day you make a soldier of them is the beginning of the end of our revolution. If slaves make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong. But they won't make soldiers. As a class, they are wanting in every qualification of soldier." We then turn to Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was one of the strongest advocates for black participation in the Union Army. And he said upon the passage of the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, which actually called for the start of black recruitment in 1863, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." And the Douglass family took that to heart. These are Frederick Douglass's sons. On the left, we have Frederick Jr., who was a recruiting sergeant for the 54th and 55th Massachusetts, traveling around the country recruiting free black men. In the center is his son, Lewis, who was the sergeant major of the 54th Massachusetts. And on the right is his son, Charles, who's actually the first African-American from the state of New York to enlist when he joins the 54th Massachusetts. And he later goes on to become first sergeant for the 5th Massachusetts Colored Cavalry, a unit we're going to discuss in a little bit. Now, the interesting thing is that some states did not wait for federal permission to raise black units. One of the most famous is the 1st Kansas, which was comprised of escaped slaves from Missouri and freedmen from Kansas itself, and they were formed in 1862. Another interesting experiment, which has a tie to Nyack, is directly after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, Daniel Ullman, who's pictured here, is sent down to New Orleans, which had recently been captured, to raise the Corps d'Afrique. And the Cour d'Afrique is interesting, obviously because of the French name, because of New Orleans. The non-commissioned officer corps that would later staff the Cour d'Afrique actually attempted to fight for the Confederacy first. They tried to form a militia in New Orleans, and the Confederate government responded. These were free black men and mixed race men living in New Orleans. The Confederacy responded by demanding that they disarm. Even free black men in the Confederacy bearing arms was too much for them to bear. So when New Orleans is captured, because very few people in the Union Army spoke Creole or French, and that was the majority of what the recruits spoke, they actually recruited these men who had initially tried to form up a local Louisiana militia. Daniel Ullman is also buried in Nyack at Oak Hill. So by the May of 1864, all these different units are basically, with a few very distinct exceptions, are all reclassified under the United States Colored Troops, which was an organization within the Union Army. Now, there are two incidents in April of 1864 that really drive home just the different risks that African Americans were taking by serving in the USCT. So in the West, you have the Battle of Poison Springs in Arkansas. There, the 1st Kansas is massacred while attempting to surrender. They are bayoneted while wounded on the ground. Essentially, there's no quarter given to them. Then in the East, you have Fort Pillow. Fort Pillow, an outnumbered garrison, is attempting to surrender after resisting heartily to a force led by Nathan Bedford Forrest. Nathan Bedford Forrest would go on to be the founder, and I believe the first Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. He ordered basically no quarter to be given, and the surrendering black troops at Fort Pillow and their white officers were killed almost en masse. That was the other thing. There were no black officers in the USCT. They were led by white Army officers, and the Confederacy made it abundantly clear that white officers who would be captured on the field having led black troops would be executed for fomenting servile rebellion. They would not be taken prisoner. And that blacks would either be executed or returned to a state of slavery. So some are actually captured before the end of the war, but the Confederate policy was incredibly brutal towards the USCT troops. And some say that it actually caused the USCT troops to be some of the hardest fighting troops because they knew there would be no surrender for them. So turning to the men in Mount Moor, first would turn to Andrew Casson. Andrew Casson, his name is spelled many different ways. It's spelled incorrectly with a G on his tombstone. He was born in slavery in Princess Anne County, Virginia. That's today's Virginia Beach. And he made it to Union lines in Norfolk, December 1st, 1863, and joins the 1st U.S. Colored Cavalry. And his military records are very sparse. They show that he was in the hospital for almost the entire war. And it wasn't until I took a deep dive into the local newspapers that I found out that the reason he was in the hospital is that at either the Battle of Swiss Creek or the Battle of Petersburg, Andrew Casson was shot in the chest and suffered mightily for months and was lucky to survive it. And the crazy thing to think about it is that that Confederate bullet rests below the ground at Mount Moor with Andrew Casson to this day. He carried it for the rest of his life. So he's wounded so terribly that he eventually gets transferred to a hospital called the Camp Hospital. It's on David's Island, which is an island off the coast of New Rochelle. At one point in the Civil War, the Camp Hospital was the largest hospital in America between wounded Union troops and captured Confederates. And there at the Camp Hospital, he meets John W. Tout from Nyack. And Tout is taken so much by his story that he actually hires Casson as a servant. And he works for Tout for 18 years. He works for Tout for the rest of his life. You're going to see a connection between John Tout and these veterans. You're going to see it through the St. Philip's AME Zion Church. Andrew Casson actually became a trustee of that church. And his obituary carried the line, "He will be missed by many, especially the little folks for whom he was a great favorite and exercised a tender care. Next, we'll turn to Charles Mayo. Charles Mayo was born in slavery in Richmond, Virginia in 1833. And now the interesting thing about that is that the mayor of Richmond, Virginia during the Civil War and for years afterwards was Joseph Carrington Mayo. So it's a possibility that he had been owned by the Mayo family. Now in 1861, at the start of the war, when he was 28 years old, he was sold in Virginia. Now we don't know exactly where he was sold, but he winds up in Arkansas in 1863. So just speculating here, Mayo was sold down the river. That's a term that is still used today, and it's to signify slaves who would be sold in the upland South to the deep South, Louisiana and Arkansas, where the work was a lot more brutal, the conditions were a lot more brutal, and it was usually seen as a punishment. If someone tried to escape, they would be sold down the river. So that's possibly what happened to Mayo. But he found himself in Helena, Arkansas, free by making it to Union lines. That's the thing. By 1863, by the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union Army is inherently an army of liberation. Everywhere they go, they have trains of refugees who are liberating themselves by joining on with the safety and comfort of the Union Army. Charles Mayo was one of those men. In April of 1863, he enlisted in the 1st Regiment Arkansas Infantry Volunteers of African Descent. That is a very long name, but that was another experimental unit created by General Lorenzo Thomas. In 1864, it's redesignated the 46 USCT. Charles Mayo was a member of Company E. They served during the Vicksburg campaign. They saw action at Mound Plantation, and just to drive home the risk that they were facing. The Confederate Army on numerous occasions during the war went on slaving raids during the war. And a large slaving raid was undertaken into Louisiana, and 2 full companies of the 46 USCT were captured and were marched west into Louisiana and Texas and returned to a state of slavery. They say as many as 1,000 freed blacks were captured during this raid. So it wasn't Mayo's unit, but it was part of his regiment. So the danger was real. They spend the rest of the war between Vicksburg and Memphis before they're sent in February of 1865 down to Texas to prevent the Confederate high command from escaping into Mexico. And that's where Charles Mayo was discharged at Boca Chica, Texas in January 30th, 1866. So he actually leaves there, returns to Richmond, and marries his wife, Eliza. I would suffice to say that he perhaps left Eliza behind in 1861 when he was sold down to Arkansas. He moved to Nyack in 1872, and he gave his profession as a rag dealer and a junk man. He was a member of St. Philip's AME Church, and by 1886, he actually became pastor of that church. There's a great note here, if you can see it. I'm trying to make sure you guys can see it. I'll move this over. Essentially saying that he was traveling down south to North Carolina, Maryland, and Virginia in 1887 as a pastor to visit various churches. And it also noted that he would be back in time for Watch Night. For those who don't know, Watch Night is a quasi-religious ceremony marking the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, which came into effect on January 1st, 1863, and they watched it on New Year's Eve. So that's where you get Watch Night from. And it's just amazing to think that he returned to the city of Richmond dressed, in pastor's garb on streets that he once wore chains. It's a very powerful story. And also, you start to see the interconnection between these men. The December 8th, 1888 Rockland County Journal notes that Mayo served as the best man for Frank Smith, who married Andrew Casson's widow, Jane, who we mentioned earlier, at St. Philip's. He basically becomes chaplain for about a lot of organizations we're going to talk about, and he actually conducts a funeral service for a bunch of the men who rest in Mount Moor, and he passed away in 1908. Now, we talked about other states making their own organizations. And in Rhode Island, it was interesting because Rhode Island Governor James Y. Smith wrote to Lincoln and essentially demanded that he be given the right to raise an African regiment because of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment of the American Revolution, which was a black regiment in the American Revolution. It's often credited as the first black military unit in America. James Y. Smith said he claimed ancestral rights to raising a black regiment. He's finally given permission in June of 1863. They raise a bunch of units. One of the units they raise is the 14th Rhode Island Heavy Artillery. It's eventually renamed to the 11th U.S. Colored Artillery Heavy. The heavy designation showed that they were siege guns, not field pieces, so they were designed to batter fortresses down. James N. Miller enlists there. They train on Dutch Island in Narragansett Bay, and they do most of their service in Louisiana. And there in Louisiana, at Pollock Mine, Louisiana, 3 members of Company A are captured by a Confederate raiding party. Samuel O. Jefferson, Anthony King, and Samuel Mason, of Company G. And they were taken to a town called Indian Village, and they were summarily executed by the Confederates. Again, we're just seeing the danger that would exist even for units that didn't actually engage in battle. John N. Miller is discharged at Camp Parapet with a debilitating bowel disease. He comes home to Nyack, and he dies just 2 or 3 years later at only 30 years old. Now, the next soldier is actually the soldier that got me involved in Mount Moor. Logan Lafayette, whose heavily weathered tombstone you can see here, was vandalized a couple of years back. And I had read an article in the news that I'd come across it. And it took me some time to track everybody down. But Logan Lafayette's story is interesting in that he's often credited as being a member of the 54th Massachusetts. The 54th Massachusetts is one that is one of the most well-known African units during the war, and it was depicted in the movie Glory. They had their amazing assault on Fort Wagner. And the reason for this is that his tombstone is so heavily weathered that you can only make out 5 and mass. But in reality, Logan Lafayette was a member of the 5th Massachusetts Colored Cavalry. Now, this is also a misnomer because they were never issued horses, so they fought as dismounted infantry for the entire war. But he was a cook in Kingston, New York, before he enlisted, and he actually served as the company cook and tailor. And he would have taken part on June 15th, the battle at Baylor's Farm, which is the first attack led by black troops in Virginia. After that battle, they moved to Point Lookout, Maryland, where they guarded Confederate prisoners of war. And then after, when Richmond falls in 1865, they are actually the 1st regiment of the 15th Corps to march into the Trader capital. So the things that Logan Lafayette's eyes have seen, that's why it's so important that we get him a new headstone so that his story can be accurately told. Speaking of new headstones, we'll turn to Solomon E. Miller. And when we talk about how the ensuing years have not been kind, Solomon E. Miller is one of the most drastic cases. He's actually from Amsterdam, New York, up in Montgomery County. And he enlisted in 1863 and was actually a substitute. Now, the interesting thing about this, you talk about class in America in 1863. If you got drafted and you didn't want to fight, you could pay a man $300 and he would fight in your stead. That was a substitute. So that's what Solomon Miller was. He was a substitute for a William Brown of Amsterdam. And that $300 would be about $5,000 in today's money. So he joined the 8th USCT. They mustered in Pennsylvania. And he's actually the Mount Moor veteran with the most documented combat experience. As you can see over here, he was in action at a variety of battles. He took part in the Battle of Deep Bottom in 1864. Then he was in the trenches at Petersburg before Richmond. And then on September 29th, he took part in the Battle of Chaffin's Farm in Newmarket Heights, in which the Colored Brigade assaulted the Heights twice at a murderously high cost, but actually managed to chase away Robert E. Lee's best troops. Then on October 27th, he's involved in the combat at Fair Oaks. That cost the Union Army 1,600 casualties to just 100 Confederate casualties. Now, he then takes place in the Appomattox campaign, and if you look in the top right, you'll see he was noted in the town ledger after the war that he was actually present at the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. So I like to think that all of these plantation owners that thought of themselves as these gallivanting Chevalier knights had to walk past Solomon E. Miller, a man that they would have considered property. And they had to look him in the eye when they surrendered because they were beat. Now, he actually returns to Amsterdam, and we don't have really much information on him. He seems to be living there until 1918. He's one of the longest lived veterans in Mount Moor. And he dies in Nyack. There are a lot of Millers in Mount Moor, so we think that he was most likely a family member. Now we turn to the unit that provides the most men that we have in Mount Moor, and that's the 26 USCT. Now, the 26 USCT was, it really can be considered New York's USCT regiment, that along with the 20th and 30th USCTs. They were all founded by the Union League. And the Union League is interesting because the Union League it still exists. There's a Union League in Philadelphia. There's a Union League in New York City. It existed as a patriotic organization among well-to-do businessmen in New York. Now, again, to deal with the politics of the 1860s, many of the wealthy in New York City had both familial ties and business ties to the South. So Confederate sympathy was running very high in New York City. And the Union League was basically founded to say, you know, we reject that and we embrace America. Now, the 26 USCT was raised under the auspices of the Union League at Rikers Island. They actually mobilized on Rikers Island long before it was a prison. And the commander of the 26 USCT was William Silliman. He was actually a captain in the 124th New York, and he had been noted for his heroism at Gettysburg. And he was subject to a heavy screening. All USCT officers were subject to screening because the Army just didn't want to promote guys who wanted easy promotions or guys that would abuse or misuse their African-American troops. So once he passed the test, he was promoted to colonel. And given the command of the 26 USCT, the unit moves out to South Carolina near Beaufort. They see action in the Sea Isles, the Battle of John's Island. Then they support General Sherman's march to the sea at the Battle of Honey Hill and Tolfini, where Sullivan is wounded and later dies from his wounds suffered at Tolfini. Now, the interesting thing, as we talk about St. Philip's AME Zion Church, is that the AME Zion Church acted as a recruiting station for the 26 USCT. This is a monument from Ithaca, New York, and frankly, St. Philip's probably needs a monument like this outside of it, showing the men of that congregation who went to go fight for God and liberty with the 26 USCT. And this all relates to John Tout, who we'll see with the next veteran. This is Samuel Thompson. And as you can see, the years have not been kind to Samuel Thompson's. Also, Samuel doesn't even get his full name. He gets SAM-L. So the new headstone that we were going to get for him, it's going to actually say Samuel Thompson in its full. He was from Orangetown, and he was 28 years old when he enlisted in Company A of the 26 UCT. Now, he's promoted to corporal at some point. We have no real documentation why he was promoted to corporal. Most corporal promotions would have come from battlefield performance. So there's a chance that he distinguished himself on the battlefield. But by July of 1864, he's hospitalized with disease. So the 26 USCT is just hammered with disease. You have malaria in the swamps of the Sea Isles, and you also have tuberculosis, which spread like wildfire among the men. So while he was hospitalized in Beaufort, he wrote to John W. Tout to thank him for sending him cigars while he was in the hospital. So it's clear that they were friends beforehand. Tout was a resident of Nyack. He made his fortune in the saddle and horse tack business. He was an ardent abolitionist ever since a trip to the South when he was 19. He was disgusted by the institution of chattel slavery. He was a devout Methodist and dedicated his life to the cause of equality. In 1859, he founded St. Philip's AME Zion Church, providing the funds for both the building and the minister's salary. Tout was also considered that he was most likely part of the Underground Railroad, helping freed slaves escape into Canada. Eventually, Thompson is transferred to the Camp Hospital, and it's possible that Tout was visiting him when he met Andrew Cassens. You see, they're all connected. He returned to Nyack. He dies 4 years later. He's only 34 years old. It was most likely from the disease he had contracted during the war. Then we turn to a relative of his, Thomas Thompson. He was born in Piermont. He's also a member of Company A. As you can see, after the war in 1875, there's this big advertisement advertising a bush meeting, which was essentially a revival of the AME Zion Church to be held at a place called Touts Grove. Now, I'm not familiar where Touts Grove is. It would be an interesting thing to actually see where in the village of Nyack that is. It was rather large. The ad notes it could hold 5,000 people. And at the bottom of the advertisement there, you'll see Thomas Thompson was the treasurer of the Society of the AME Zion Church. You're also going to see William H. Myers, who is the secretary. He's a veteran. We don't know where he was buried. He might be buried at Mount Moor. He's going to be involved in all of these organizations we're going to talk about. Now, in 1889, the Rockland County Journal noted that Thompson had been elected a trustee of the AME Zion Church. And his obituary noted that all of the members of Waldron Post 82 attended in mass in 1908. They also noted that he was involved with the AME Zion Church for 40 years. His wife predeceased him by 3 weeks. She probably lies in an unmarked grave somewhere near his tombstone. And his funeral service was actually led by Reverend Mayo, who we discussed earlier. Now we turn to Benjamin Samuels. Benjamin Samuels was born in Orangetown in 1831. He married Diana Cisco in 1854. He left behind a daughter, Fanny, when he enlisted in Company A. He is hospitalized almost immediately upon his arrival, and he's in the hospital for 11 months, again, with these terrible infectious diseases. He also is transferred to Camp Hospital and eventually is transferred to Hart's Island. Hart's Island is famous. That's New York City's Potter's Field. That's where the indigent dead are buried to this day. There's something on the order of about 1 million people have been buried there over the last 160 years. So he's discharged actually a month later than the rest of the unit because he took that long to heal. He starts a trash hauling business when he gets back to Nyack, and he becomes a fixture in the community. And this ad that I have here ran in the Rockland County Journal for literally decades. And it reads, Benjamin Samuels, scavenger, vaults cleaned, all works in scavenge line done at low prices. And he actually the newspaper notes that he was actually awarded municipal contracts for trash collection in the various towns. So he made quite a name for himself in business. And he passed that his wealth on to the AME Zion Church. Here we have an 1885 article which talks about him assisting, again, William H. Myers, in what they called a jug breaking. That was an interesting form of fundraising at the time. You would write what you were going to give and put it into a little clay jar that you couldn't take it back out of, most likely like a Salvation Army bell ringer. You drop the coin in and it goes down. And then they would break open the jugs during the mass and essentially read out what everyone had donated and celebrate. Now, he passes away in Nyack in 1909. He was 78 years old, which is not bad for a guy who spent a year in the hospital during the war. He didn't think he would probably make it to 40, and he made it to 78. He lived a long and fruitful life, and his wife, Diana, who was married to for 55 years, died 13 days after he died. Next, we have William Samuels, who was most likely related to Benjamin. He's actually the oldest of the Company A recruits. He was either 40 or 43 when he enlisted, born in either 1820 or 1823. And when he was born, slavery was still legal in New York. Now, the 1820 census showed that 124 people were enslaved in Rockland County. Now, legislation had been passed in 1817, which had freed all slaves born before July 4, 1799. But those born to enslaved mothers, they stayed indentured until 1827. Now, the 1880 census notes that he lives on Africa Lane, which is what they called Catherine Street back in those days. So he dies in 1903, and you think about the scale of his life. So when he was born, his neighbors, very well likely, perhaps members of his family, were enslaved to the descendants of the patroons in Rockland County. And 2 years before he died, Booker T. Washington was hosted by Theodore Roosevelt at an official state dinner in the White House. And that transformation is caused by the service of the men at Mount Moor and men like them. Now we turn to John Tallman. John Tallman had a interesting experience during the war. He was born in Clarkstown in 1832. He gave his profession as a polisher, which was indicate that he was in the metal trade. But he spent the majority of his enlistment at Beaufort Hospital as an orderly, where he would perform things that the female nurses would not be expected to, such as moving living patients and corpses, and he may have even assisted during surgical procedures. Now, a surgeon's ward during the Civil War was a charnel house of sawed-off limbs and stuff, so this was obviously very unpleasant work. So he works there for 11 months, and he also lived on Africa Lane. He was a neighbor of William Samuel's. And his daughter Antoinette is actually the first wedding at the AME Zion Church in 1888. They called it a Symphony of Chocolate and Ebony, and that was the marriage between her and a Mr. C.H. Lee of White Plains. Now, the interesting thing with researching John Tallman in the newspapers, I thought I had hit a gold mine because I saw many, many mentions of John Tallman. But as it became more and more clear, and I saw that the newspapers were talking about, horse trading, real estate deals with tens of thousands of dollars, an election to assessor, an election to the supervisor of highways, I quickly realized that the John Tallman who hauled those bodies around in South Carolina was not the John Tallman that they were talking about. And it was an interesting thing to think about because you have a relatively small town, and you have 3 men named John Tallman. You have John Tallman of the 26 USCT, and you have a father and son who were very politically connected. And it led to believe, it kind of like knocked me over with a feather to think why they would share the same first and last name. John Tallman was born 5 years after the end of slavery in New York, but it's a distinct possibility that his first and last name was an echo of slavery. The Tallman name goes back to Harmon Tallman, who settled in Nyack in 1676. So this is, they were there for quite some time. He died on March 14th, 1898, and his wife Diana joined him in 1905. They share a headstone, as you can see here, and they were married for 48 years. Now we turn to Company D of the 26 USCT. We have one member of Company D, and that's Henry Adams. He was born in Haverstraw in 1834. His grave incorrectly lists 1820. He gave his profession as boatman, so he was working in Haverstraw Bay, and he was paid a $375 bounty. He's possibly a replacement. We just don't have the documentation on it now. So the funny thing about that is that after he enlisted, the June 4th, 1864 Rockland County Journal lists a Henry Adams of Haverstraw as being drafted and not reporting. And it just shows you how hard a draft was in 1864. He didn't report because he was already in the war. And the article itself goes on to complain about the backlog of ineligible men that were involved. So after returning from the 26th, he became involved in the African Wesleyan Church, which was located on Clinton Street in Haverstraw. It's often called the oldest African church in Rockland County. And you can see that he was mentioned in the newspaper. Here in 1867, he thanks those who donated $56 to the African Wesleyan Church. And then we have 2 mentions of fundraisings that he did in 1868 at a place called the Wigwam in Haverstraw. Delightful little coincidence. One of the other trustees was William H. Stump with an H. My family Stump with an F. So you see that they were involved in raising funds for the Strawberry Festival. Now, one of the interesting things to me is that one of these funds was talking about how they were raising money not only to repair the colored church, but also to build a school for the church's children. And that really struck home to me because Henry Adams signed his enlistment papers with an X. He was illiterate. And you can see here as he returns from the war, he wants to ensure that his children will sign with their own names. And I thought that was very powerful. The Wigwam, where these events held, were essentially a community gathering place, an open-air mall where you had different celebrations, political rallies. I believe Frederick Douglass spoke there. And it actually lasts almost until the new millennium and was demolished. In 1870, in this article, you'll see that he actually led the delegation, now calling himself captain of the Company D, celebrating the passage of the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote for African-American men. And that 15th Amendment was built on the legacy of the men of Mount Moor and the other members of the USCT. He passed away in Nyack, June 15th, 1895. Then we turn to Samuel Thompson. Samuel Thompson, unfortunately, as you can see here, his gravestone has been spray painted. That is not any sort of moss. That is actually someone painted brown paint on the stone. He's actually the second Samuel Thompson. The first one serves in Company A. He's from Bergen County, New Jersey. And in 1840, he gave his job upon enlistment as either bookmaker or basket maker when he joined Company F. So what's interesting about his military record is that it explicitly says that he was promoted in combat. He was promoted on July 7th, 1864 during the Battle of Bloody Bridge on Johns Island, South Carolina. And as you can see here, it notes appointed corporal when Joseph Waters was killed. That was the previous corporal for the 5th. And the 26th was involved in incredibly heavy combat on the 7th of July. A 1,000-man advance was broken by a Confederate countercharge driven by local militia, mostly rice plantation owners, which led to a panicked retreat. I went to Fort Benning myself, and though I was not a member of the infantry. The infantry motto to this day is "Follow me," with the response being "Lead the way." And I can very easily imagine Samuel Thompson on that day in July in 1864, after Joseph Waters fell, saying "Follow me," and the men of the 26th saying "Lead the way." He passed away in 1882. So now we talk about how these men are all connected and how they gave back to their community. So in 1890, St. Philip's AME Church created a chapter of the National Afro-American League, which had actually came into existence that year. It was an avenue for advocating for African-American rights. It's basically a predecessor unit of the NAACP. And it was born out of a July 1890 incident in which a black newspaper publisher named Timothy Thomas Fortune was denied a drink at Trainer's Hotel Bar on 33rd Street and 6th Avenue in Manhattan, with the bartender saying, "We don't serve colored people here." So Fortune refused to leave, demanding a drink, and eventually was arrested for disorderly conduct for refusing to leave. And he went on to sue the hotel and was represented by an African-American attorney, T. McCants Stewart. And he actually won a judgment of $1,016.23 from an all-white jury. And the hotel actually lost their appeal. So for a couple of years at the end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century, the Afro-American League tried to use the legal system in order to win black rights. And we'll see here that elected president is William H. Myers. We talk about him again and again. He was a sergeant in the 5th United States Colored Artillery. And then from clockwise around the circle, we have Benjamin Samuels was the second vice president. Charles Mayo was chaplain, of course. And the executive committee contained Thomas Thompson and William Samuels. And then we turn to the other organization they were members of, the Grand Army of the Republic. As I said, I'm a member of the organization that takes up the legacy of the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, the Grand Army of the Republic was pretty radical for its time in the fact that it was racially integrated. Most organizations like this, fraternal organizations, would not have been racially integrated, but the racial integration on the battlefield, not with units, the units were still segregated, but fighting side by side, led to the GAR to welcome brothers of all colors. We refer to ourselves as brother. So the interesting thing is that these were essentially social clubs. They held dances and clam bakes. Actually, the GAR was famous for their yearly bean bake throughout the country. And essentially, you would join different camps. It was like having a different watering hole to go to. But in Nyack, in the black community, they wanted to start their own GAR post. And they started the first all-black GAR post in New York State, which is post number 172. And they named it for Colonel Silliman of the 26th, who was their commander who had been killed. And this went on for about 15 years. And as we can see here, we go around the circle. John Tallman, of course, the commander, William H. Myers. The man was a true pinnacle of the community. He's involved in every one of these organizations. Senior vice commander was John Tallman. Junior vice commander, which is the rank I hold, was Henry Adams. The chaplain, Charles Mayo. The officer of the day was Samuel Goldfield. He was a corporal in Company A of the 26th USCT. And the quartermaster was Benjamin Samuels. So the lasting impact of the GAR and NIAC can actually be seen directly in front of our host, the NIAC Library's building. You have the Lincoln Boulder. And the Lincoln Boulder was essentially a rather famous boulder on the NIAC shore that was dragged up by a team of 18 horses and plonked down in front of the library. And a bronze plaque was added with Abraham Lincoln's immortal but brief Gettysburg Address. And this is the picture from the dedication in 1908. Now, this is Waldron Post 82. This was it for GAR posts in NIAC. By 1908, the other posts had died out, and they'd all consolidated to Waldron Post 82. And now we know for a fact that on that day in 1908, there were 5 African-American members in Post 82. And that's going to be Private George Brown, Private Benjamin Samuels, who we talked about with the trash hauling business, and Private James Thompson, all from Alpha Company 26 USCT. We also had Corporal J.H. Williamson, who was in Fox Company. And we had Sergeant William H. Myers, again, from Company K, 5th United States Colored Artillery. And if you look to the left, you will see that 3 of those 5 men were present that day in 1908. Now, I don't know which men they were, but there's a chance that we could be looking right now at the face of Benjamin Samuels, one of the men of Mount Moor, or William H. Myers, who very well possibly could be buried in Mount Moor. The Thompsons, James Thompson, it's very possible that he was buried. A lot of these men were buried with wooden tombstones that would have just gone away over the years. So to bring it all together, this is Colonel Augustus Van Horn Ellis. That's who my camp is named after. And he was noted on the second day of Gettysburg. He was on horseback, and he was motivating his men. And his aides were very nervous because this was the second day of the battle. Officers had been struck down all over the field. And they said to him, sir, can you dismount and remove yourself to the rear? And he said, no, the men must see us today. And he was killed, shot through the forehead shortly thereafter, struck dead. And that quote, the men must see us today, is what I think about Mount Moor. The men must see us. We must go to them. Mount Moor should be visited, should be taken care of, and we must see them. And we must see their service, and we have to tell their stories. And I'm been honored tonight to tell some of those stories to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, William. I'm sending a note. Rosemary, can we go to the grid now so we can see some of the 60 participants who have enjoyed this incredible lecture that I've heard 3 times now, Bill, and it's riveting. It's more riveting every time. There's just so much incredible history that is before us. So can we? There we go. So it's good to see everybody. I have a couple of folks that I imagine, I hope will want to say something, but out of respect to the person who has really kept the Mount Moor Cemetery Association going through the years, president of the NAACP in Spring Valley, Willie Trotman, I'd like to know, Mr. Trotman, if you would like to pitch the ceremonial first question.
First, let me just thank Bill Stump for finding us. That's number one. That was an incredible job. I think number 2 is for reaching out and putting together this. And thank you, Bill. And thank you for the people, especially Ed and Bill, Sandra, Gloria, Candace, Nicole, Dorothy, Robert Ellison, and especially Dave Smith. for helping us get along in this project. I mean, it's fascinating, truly fascinating. Yeah, I think I would. I think I saw Win Perry also, who's a documenter. I think we probably need to take this at least one step forward. I know we're trying to make sure that the cemetery, is up to par. Thank you for helping us, with the headstones, Oak Hill people. But can we put this in some kind of documentary flavor? I guess that's the question that I want to ask for.
Bill, are you up for a book or a documentary?
Sounds good to me.
I think it's well worth it. I just think it's awesome to understand that back then these are the people who made it possible for me, Ellison, and I, and Ed to serve in an integrated armed forces. So yeah, we'd be glad to support it. We're 100% behind it.
Well, how far are you on your work? How many of the stories have you been able to document so far, Bill? Are you getting through the?
Well, now we're into the I'm into the unmarks, which are guys that we know that are buried there and are not have no headstones, or they had headstones that no longer exist. And then there's some triumph and tragedy there as well. Another thing that I'm finding just in the searching, I'm also finding non-veterans who we know based on newspaper accounts of their funerals that were buried in Mount Moor that don't appear on any of our lists. So that's the real thing that I find fascinating about Mount Moor. The actual number of people that were buried there could be an order of magnitude above what we ever thought was documented. And not to mention the veterans that were buried there are an order of magnitude of what are currently marked.
Very good. Well, thank you. We will support you in continuing your work. So I note that there's a descendant of Harmon Tolman on the call. And when I received the summary of John Tolman's story, I immediately sent it to Win. So how do you find all this, Win?
I think it's fascinating. I knew Hezekiah Easter very well. I knew his father, who maintained a used building materials yard right next to Mount Moor, and kept an eye on it, on the cemetery before the days of the Pyramid Mall. I'm very glad to see, and I knew Ruth Easter, Hezekiah Jr.'s wife, very glad to see the Easter family get the credit that they deserve for their work in the preservation of the cemetery. Yes, I'm a descendant of Harmon Tolman, and I have an ancestor named John Tolman. I don't know whether he's the one that Bill Stump found references to among the three John Tolmans that he mentioned, but he was a couple of generations older than the John Tolman who's buried at Mount Moor. It could very well, I haven't looked up the census to see whether he owned slaves, but he may well have. It may have been the owner of the Mount Moor John Thompson's parents or grandparents. Of course, I'm ashamed of the general legacy of slavery, but I'm not at all afraid of what research may determine in the way of possible relationships. But thank you, Bill.
Oh, absolutely, man. And thank you for continuing to host programs like this. And I'd like to ask anyone else, you've been keeping an eye on the chat, Rosemary. Are there any questions that we need to bring to JVC Stump's attention?
Well, just looking through the chat, I can scroll. The first question I asked was, is Gettysburg where there was an electric map? That may have been electric train. There actually was an electric train. When you drive on Gettysburg and you drive on the road, you are actually driving on the Gettysburg Electric Scenic Railroad that ran through there for a couple of years after the war as a sightseeing railroad. It has since been turned into the road through the camp. And as to Solomon Miller, one of the funnest things about doing these investigations is, as a governmental employee myself, good enough for government work. The amount of mistakes and stuffs like that, there was no standardization. Some would say complexion black, some would say complexion dark, some would say complexion African. There was no standardization. So basically, when we're dealing with these records, we are just on the whim of the enlistment officer who filled out these applications. There was not any sort of uniformity between them.
Thank you, Bill. Any other questions? People can raise a hand if they want, or they don't want to use the chat. And Rosemary and Georgia. Okay, so I see Mike Hayes and then James Dusenberry. So Mike, you unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And thanks, Bill and Bill. This is more of a comment and an observation. And, thank you for unveiling the lives of a lot of people who are really true heroes. Just as remarkable, the willingness to serve and the difficulties they overcame. It's just amazing. And it's a great testament to America. I was struck by one thing, which is, and I guess I shouldn't be surprised by this, but you had these people who served as veterans and, worked really hard and all kinds of things. They come back and, you mentioned some of the occupations that people had, and they were, all kind of menial positions. And you talked about a person that couldn't get a drink in a bar. And I guess this is not a surprise at all, but it's just amazing that was allowed to happen. I know it happened at many different wars in America, but I'm just really struck by that how poorly we treated so many of our heroes. So
Ike,
I don't know if you guys have a comment, but
no.
by that.
There was something that was included in one of your earlier presentations.
Yes,
the one that was 90 minutes long.
Yes.
You mentioned the reception that the colored troops got when they were applying for their pensions, and who was responsible for making those decisions in Congress. Do you want to mention that?
Yes. So one of the tragedies, and this is a tragedy that was also experienced by white veterans after the war, is that the greatest stumbling block in the American Congress to the passage of pensions for Union veterans were Southern politicians. So you had politicians who fought for the Confederacy, who now 10, 15, 20 years later are doing their damnedest in Congress to ensure that pensions would not be passed or given. Now, there's another veteran who I secured a headstone for in East Yard Cemetery in Yorktown. His name is Ebenezer Peterson. He was also in Company A of the 26 USCT. He died of tuberculosis that he got in South Carolina in 1864. His mother was approved for a pension in 1900. Took her 34 years to get a pension for her 24-year-old son dying. It's grotesque. The amount of things that they used to have to do. I have another veteran that I'm working on getting a grave for in Philadelphia. He had to actually, his wife actually had to get slaves from the plantation that he was enslaved on to advocate that was who he really was. So you had to have these long written diatribes. It took years for these guys to get pensions. And when we talk about these veterans, we talk about the unmarks. There's one unmarked. He was in the 14th Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, Richard Cisco. Richard Cisco, from dealing with newspaper accounts of him, he struggled with alcoholism after the war, and it was often in the 1880s equivalent of the police blotter in the Rockland County Journal. And on February 10th, 1891, two people find him in the street. They attempt to walk him home. They left him in front of his gate of his house by Bard Street. Another person came along later in the evening, and they took him into the horse barn, and they threw some horse blankets over him. And the next morning, age 55 years old, he froze to death in the night, Richard Cisco. And this is a story that we see in America constantly. This is just like every other abandoned veteran we see on the road who are homeless that suffer through these things. And talking about me as the Sons of Union veterans, how I have to be there and keep green their memories. Richard Cisco met a terrible and tragic end on that February night, and I consider it an honor to be working with the Mount Moor Cemetery Association. His grave is currently unmarked. He was lost to history, and we're going to bring him back, and he's going to rest with honor under the headstone that he's entitled to. He never was given the respect he deserved in life. The least we can do is give it to him now in death.
Thank you. James Dusenberry. And then the screen name is Amani. You'll be next.
Yeah, I was going to mention the fact that none of this is done in high school. You don't learn anything about this in high school, and that's a shame. The other thing is that I know for a fact to this day that 22 veterans commit suicide over wars. The veterans that came home from Vietnam were spit upon. So it seems that we have a systemic problem here with taking care of our veterans all the way from the Revolutionary War to the present day. And it doesn't seem like anything is being taken care of on this issue, and it really bothers me. I'm glad that this is being said about the grave sites, but there are a lot of grave sites around the United States. We have one in New Milford that dates back to the Revolutionary War that half the tombstones aren't there. Thank you very much for this. But I just want to mention the fact that veterans, they come home and they get this attitude, thank you very much, we don't need you anymore. And it's sad. It's really sad.
Thank you. Screen name Amani.
Okay, but mine is my wife. My name is Kwando.
Kwando. Thank you, Kwando.
Okay. Fabulous, very important, very critical, and yes, we both would back up any documentary that will result from this work. But one of the things that really hits me strongly is that there's a legacy of African/African Caribbean, African American militancy and martial arts. And I personally saw a creative line that went actually from the Haitian Revolution up to New Orleans in terms of the slave rebellions, up to the Civil War itself. And I think about people such as Osborne Perry Anderson, who was with John Brown at Harper's Ferry, and who in fact survived that raid. It wasn't part of the Civil War, but it certainly was a part of Black, if you will, martial arts, the ability to fight against enslavement. And his subsequent escape from Harper's Ferry, and then he re-enters into one of the units in the Civil War under a pseudonym. And one of his relatives found the grave when he finally died in 1867, and he was reburied not too far from, in DC, from FedEx Stadium itself. Right. The point I'm raising here is that I think this information really underlines not the sudden emergence of Black militias and Black arms, but there's a history of our resistance from the Haitian right up through the Civil War. And I think that's why a documentary of this order will in fact raise those question issues, because I think some of the problems is that we tend to think that the African/African Americans' response to oppression was momentary in the Civil War itself. No, it has a pretext to it. It has a long history, and we need to honor that also.
Yeah, and
Bill, I hope it wouldn't be a repetition, but you used a quote at one point about Frederick Douglass and about putting the pin on.
Yeah, I was just about to get into that. So it's wonderful that you brought that up, and especially when we talk about that whole narrative of Haiti. Haiti was terrifying to the Confederates.
Yes.
Haiti was what they envisioned would happen. And you see, we have, it's amazing you bring up John Brown. Today, of course, is the anniversary of John Brown being hung. He was hung today in I'm going to lose my history point. It's 1857? Sorry, folks.
59.
59, sorry, can't get them all. But yes, and that's the thing too, is this whole idea of when the free Black militia tried to arm themselves for the Confederacy. Well, they really were arming for themselves for Louisiana. They were defending their local homes. They were terrified. The white Confederate power structure was terrified because you had the German Coast Rebellion, which is something that is almost never talked about. And that's the whole thing with the story of the USCTs. Is I talk about that the Army, the Union Army from 1863 was inherently an army of liberation, and there's a lot of fractured history there with the fact that the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't come until 2 years into the war. The Emancipation Proclamation doesn't free the slaves in the border states. There's a lot of things that that are issues with it. But Frederick Douglass saw it when he said, this is the quote, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." And this idea of citizenship through service, we see it time and again. We see it in the Civil War from other groups. I'm also a big fan of Thomas Mayer and the 69th Irish Infantry from New York. The Irish were never accepted in America, and I often say that the acceptance of Irish in America came at the cost of, 3 hours of absolute bloodletting at the Sunken Road at Antietam. They had to pay a price to really be considered American. And that's what the USCT is. It was really to say, and that's the GAR. How can you turn me away from your club? How can you tell me that I can't be a member of your organization? We fought and bled and died together. Ebenezer Peterson, who rests in East Yard Cemetery, about 100 yards from him is Joseph A. Hyatt. He was from the 48th New York. Now that attack you see in Glory, that 54th Massachusetts was supported by the 48th New York. So a black unit went in first, and right behind them, fighting with them, was the 48th New York. Joseph Hyatt loses his leg during that advance. He gets sent home to Fort Schuyler, which is where the Maritime Academy is now, and he dies. And it's like, he was dead at 20 years old in 1863. And that shared sacrifice, we see that again and again throughout American history. We see it in the Spanish-American War. We see it in World War II, did more for the advancement of integration than probably any act of the early 20th century. And then we see it in Korea in 48. Harry Truman integrates the armed services. And I'm sure you saw it. People saw it again in Vietnam.
Yeah.
How could you take a kid from a racist environment and you put him side by side with people who are different from him, dodging bullets and cowering in foxholes? Racism is going to be the first casualty.
Bill, I'm going to take a question from James Liner, which will be our last question. And we're going to hear final remarks from the president of the Mount Moor Association at England. But please just tell us a little bit about the disparity between the remembrances of this period of time between the Sons of the Confederacy and the Sons of the Union Army, and how in terms that are very impactful today, with discussions about monuments and flags, where the Union Army certainly did win the war, but how possibly the Confederacy won the peace.
It all relates back to the failure of Reconstruction. And essentially, I often bring this quote up. The Sons of the Confederacy have about 70,000 members nationwide. The Sons of Union Veterans, we claim about 6,000. So we're outnumbered over 10 to 1. And quite frankly, they have quite a lot of money to support projects like this. These Confederate monuments are well maintained, and they're also still putting them up. There are Confederate monuments, even in the current climate, that are still being erected for the first time. And we're talking about, we're 150 years after the close of the war. When was the last time anyone ever heard of them putting a Union monument anywhere up in the North? Our Union monuments tend to occupy forgotten corners of public spaces. And, a bunch of them were taken over after the First World War and made to veterans memorials. And it all comes back down to the myth of the lost cause and the rehabilitation fronted by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who are responsible for putting up most of the Confederate monuments that we are still dealing with till today. And it's a deliberate twisting of the thing. And I'm looking right now because I have to get this quote from Rhodes. I'm sorry, I apologize. I should have written this one down, but it came in the flow of the conversation. Hold on, let me see. Give me one moment. Man. Hold on.
You want me to go to James Liner and then get back to you?
Yes, yes. Just give me one
Great.
second. Thank you.
Jim, you have a question. Another historian on our call. Jim Lyon.
Yes, thank you. I just wondered if Bill knew that the grandson of Henry Adams was a fellow by the name of Elliot Cisco Sr., who maybe some of the people remember. He was around in my time as a member of Nyack Rotary, a very successful man. And Henry's great-grandson was Elliot Cisco Jr., who was a Marine in Vietnam and committed suicide in 1972. So that the thing that Mr. Duesenberry brings about has gone on for an awful long time with the pressures of military service. And then one of the things, and Mr. Stump might be interested in, Bill Myers was the first African-American to run for an elected office in the town of Orangetown. In 1873 or 74, he ran for sheriff.
Wow.
Of course, he lost, but he
That's
was the first
fascinating.
African-American. And in the same time, Mount Moor has another first. You talk about Hezzy Easter. Hezzy Easter was the first African-American to ever serve the village board in Nyack as a trustee. He did not serve as mayor, who I just corrected on Facebook, but did serve as a trustee. And I'd be interested in trying to help. I have some history on some of these other fellows.
Absolutely. I would love to find William Myers' grave. I think that, we see his impact everywhere.
You and me both.
Yeah.
In fact, I've been after the church in Amy Zion to see if he had a picture of Bill. I happen to have a couple of pictures in my collection of African-American soldiers of the Civil War. I know who they are.
I think I might have that for you, Jim, actually, because I have a placard. My great-grandfather was George T. Avery, who was
That's
a deacon
right.
during the same period of time. And I recently found a placard that was used.
Are you relation to A.B. Brown in the World War II post?
We believe so. That's some history that I'm doing. But anyway, I think I have a picture of Myers. So let's see. Bill, were you able to find your
Yes. So
quote?
this is,
and then we're going to go and finish up with Ed England.
yeah,
Thank
this is the quote that I bring up all the time. And believe it or not, display of Confederate symbols is still a very touchy subject among certain members of the Sons of Union veterans. Now, let me put it this way. I'm eligible to join the Sons of the Confederacy. Half of my family went to Ohio. Half of the family stayed in Virginia. There's a reason why I'm not a member of the Sons of the Confederacy, if you can catch my drift.
I'm glad you're not.
So to direct your attention to the words of Elijah Hunt Rhodes, who was the colonel of the 2nd Rhode Island Infantry. He's most famously brought up, he's actually a board question during Army boards. He starts the war as a private, ends as a colonel. He's like one of the great success stories. So he delivered these remarks to the 44th encampment of the Massachusetts Grand Army of the Republic in 1910. We think of the reunited South, and I am not one of those who wants to find fault with what is done in the South. I pity those people. I have seen much of them since the war. I remember standing one day looking at a monument in Athens, Georgia, when a young collegian said to me, "I suppose you object to this monument being here." "Oh no," I said. "If you people want to perpetuate your shame, I care little about it. You are simply telling the story to your children of how you tried to pull down the old flag and failed." Another day, I stood by a monument in Winchester, Virginia, and I read upon it an inscription which told how men had died for liberty, had died for the Constitution in that country. An old gentleman asked me what I thought of it. "Oh," I said, "the day will come when you will put a ladder up against that monument, and you will hire a colored man who once wore the shackles to climb that ladder and efface every word of that inscription, for it is false. There is no truth in it. Those men were brave men, and I am willing to pay tribute to their bravery, but they did not die for liberty. They did not die for their Constitution, and they did not die for their country." So the GAR actually was adamant against Confederate monuments from the very beginning. I have literally dozens of examples of them speaking out against Confederate monuments. They thought the idea that the Confederacy should be memorialized on the field of Gettysburg, where their friends died with them, they thought it was grotesque. And it's actually interesting. The second those guys start dying out is when you see the greatest amount of those monuments put up by the children of Confederate veterans.
Bill Stump, thank you thank you very much for what you've done. Thank you very much for what you've inspired from this community, and we look forward to cooperating with you. We hope that we'll have more occasions like this to hear from you, and events at Mount Moor Cemetery where you will always be welcome. So I'd like to invite to give some closing remarks the president of the Mount Moor Cemetery Association, and my friend Ed England.
Thanks, Bill. Listen, I've been a resident of Rockland County since 1994. I was here before the Moor was built. I worshiped with Hezekiah Easter in church. And I've known of Mount Moor Cemetery, but I didn't really know it. Dick Gregory once said, "Man without knowledge of himself and his heritage is like a tree without roots." On behalf of the Mount Moor Cemetery Association, the Rockland County Buffalo Soldiers, and the elders who established these organizations, I would like to thank each of you for attending this presentation. Your presence and participation helps to ensure that we will be not like trees without roots. Special thanks to you, Bill, and you, Bill Stump, for the dedication and research put into this informative presentation. Our goal this evening is to shine a light on those who have come before us and pave the way for life as we know today. Their toil, accomplishments, and sacrifices will not be forgotten. And finally, as our program comes to a close, there's a Mount Moor Cemetery in every town and community. Where's yours? I encourage you, go find it. Have a great holiday season. Be well, stay safe, and wear your mask.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was good. That was good.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks to the library. Thanks to the Historical Society. Mount
Bill,
Moor Cemetery Association has a, okay, sorry, Willie?
Yeah, there were some people in the chat trying to find out the directions. Can you give them directions how to best get to the cemetery?
Absolutely, very good. So if you are traveling down Route 59 going west, there, right as you get to ShopRite, there's an entrance to the mall there. There is a small parking area. So you'll see, as you go straight ahead, you'll see some a grass, kind of like a triangle, little pocket park. You can see the flagpole that the town of Clarkstown has been maintaining. There's a little parking area there, but it can only hold 1 or 2 cars. So you might need to park in front of Dick's Sporting Goods and walk across. As you go through, there's a very large monument with all the names of the veterans that are interred there, and at some point we'll be able to provide people with a little bit of a legend. Hezekiah Easter's grave is somewhat prominent. It's the most recent one, and it can easily be discerned, and so you can go and say hi to Hezzy. I'm sure he'd appreciate the visit, and now you know a lot about some of the other men who are buried there, and this is just the beginning. I mean, obviously, you know, this is an extraordinary find to know that one of the men there, that a Confederate bullet is right below the surface of the soil, and that you know, a witness to the surrender of Lee at Appomattox. These are all, you know, folks that are close to us, you know, as far away as they passed away, as long as they did. This history is closer to us than we imagine, and our failure to appreciate this history will definitely impact our present and our future. So this is an extraordinary opportunity we have to not only preserve our history, but to you know, shape our future. So we thank you for being with us. The Mount Moor Cemetery Association has a Facebook page. Soon we'll have a website. We had a program on Veterans Day We weren't able to invite the public because of COVID restrictions, but we did provide it on Facebook, and we will continue to keep people involved in what we're doing. And definitely there is an encyclopedia of knowledge in the head of William Stump that we will be downloading and providing for those who are interested. So once again, thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. And this was an extraordinary gift to our community, Junior Vice Commander William Stump. Thank you.